Part 2, the Book of Remembrance, chapter 13, verse 107. And it came to pass that after Matzah explained the day of the new year, that he spoke to Enoch further, and he said, since the council of heaven, where Enoch, he said, declared that he would go into the temporal world himself to rescue his children, the great Holy One was anxious in his heart, and he worried whether his children would love his son and if they would respect him and honour his words. End of page 439. And his pleadings in their hearts, for he knew that his son was their only way back to him. Verse 108. And as the righteous and the wicked among men began to divide in the midst of the earth, this question was before his face, and it seemed that all of the handiwork of his love was groping to find their way. Verse 109. And in the midst of this perplexity of Enoch, he said, there came a wonderfully strong woman who relieved his anxiety to know whether his children would love his son. And it was on the day that Edra named the Ariel Sea. And as Edra named the sea while standing in the water, this lovely one came, who is dearly beloved by Enoch, he said, and it was Milo. And she was very strong in her determination and in her love for the Most High, and she had learned how to endure all the hardships of life. Verse 110. And in the midst of the multitude, she got herself upon a table of the fish yard, and as Edra spoke to the sea, she made great declarations to the multitude assembled, and her voice carried out over the water, and all who were present could hear her words, albeit they were not loud. Verse 111. Now she is called Milo, because she has consecrated her life in full measure to give it to Matzah the lamb, and she declared with a clear voice to all who were assembled the meaning of the living waters and the righteousness of the waters of Eden that were flowing into their land. Verse 112. And she expounded to them all the necessity of giving their lives to the son of Enoch, he said, and she rehearsed to them. On page 441, the rich meaning of such an act of consecration. And after Edra made his appeal for the people to be baptized in the waters of the Ariel Sea, she went into the waters first at the bidding of Edra, and she went down and came up out of the waters in like manner of the song of the dance, and the waters gently waved up and down together with her out of their delight. Verse 113. And it came to pass that all of the multitude followed her example, and they went into the water, and they clung to all her exhortations to give their lives fully to Matzah the lamb, holding nothing back. And it was known that the presence of Kahi had prepared the way for this to happen. 114. And in the midst of the exclamations of those in the multitude, of their intent to give their lives wholly to Matzah the lamb, all of Elder erupted into singing, and the sound of it reached into the soul of Enoch, he said, and he was brought to comfort, and his longings were answered, that his children would choose to love his son. Verse 115. And that day became for Enoch, he said, a treasured day, which he marks every year as he lives with his children. And the day became known as the day of the measure of Milo, when the Father was comforted by the richness of the gifts of the lives of the righteous to his Son. Verse 116, and they gave in full measure, withholding nothing, and this day is very dear to the heart of Enoch, page 142. And it happened on the 15th day of the season of renewal. Verse 117, and again it came to pass that Matzah explained a holy day to Enoch, and he said, I tell you these things, for in heaven, where the abode of the great Holy One is, there was concerned that the righteous children of Enoch would have adequate support to sustain them, seeing they were in the midst of the 1/3 who fell and who would not come to council with the call of Matzah the Lamb. 118, and Enoch was burdened with the prospect that his lovely ones who gave their lives to his Son would come to be hard pressed by the corruptions of evil, and that they would be left to feel alone and weak, because the Urkadeshi could not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked, insomuch that there would be no end for their tolerance for the wicked. 119, and Enoch saw from his dwelling place that Enoch had great determinations to find the element of righteousness that would protect the righteous and enable them to find support. And Enoch determined that he would divide the sons of men according to the measure of the holiness and sanctity of marriage. And he instructed the Urkadeshi plainly as to their limits in their tolerance for evil. And by his instruction, he set in motion the support of the Urkadeshi for the righteous. And in the days of Enoch, this day was called the day of instruction. But after Shem, it was called Shabuah, page 433, verse 120. And we see that because the righteous gave their lives to Matzah the Lamb, he was able to intervene to instruct Enoch, so he may divide the sons of men to gain comfort for his father, Enoch in his burden to know if his children would have support. And this day fell on a jubilee of days from the day of the measure of Milo. Verse 121, and again the Most High instructed Enoch, and he said, and there is a holy day in the memorial passages of my Father, and it is called the Feast of Tranquility, and it is not a Sabbath, and 2 days before this day is a Sabbath. And on that day you shall have a place prepared where you sleep, and you shall make it fresh and new, and you shall have a pillow of pure linen filled with clean and combed wool, so Enoch can lay his head down when he sleeps with you that night. And the day he sleeps with you is a Sabbath, and your hair may be down, for it is not a day when a person is held to account. Verse 122, and on the morrow you are to arise early in each of your encampments, and you are to select pure young maidens to dance before the inhabitants of your villages, and they are to dance to the place where the Asib is kept, and all of the women are to obtain Asib, and it is to be ground with stones, even as Matzah the Lamb did for cover, the day before the day of tranquility. And it is to be cooked with milk, and it is to be sweetened with honey, and do not withhold the honey to be miserly, and it is to have leavening, for it is the bread of peace. So we're on page 444 now, verse 124. And then on the next day, which is a jubilee of days from the day of instruction, you are to eat the bread in a feast. And the purpose of the bread is for you to be free from fear and intimidation. And you are to pray for one another and to request from Enoch protection from fear. For that night the Urkadasho shall issue forth to identify their own, and they shall suppress the fear and presence of Mosor the decadent by a mighty hand, and woe unto those whom they ignore in with their love. Verse 125, and the Most High rehearsed to him the memory of the agony and distress of heart of his father Enoch. So, and Motzah, the lamb, rehearsed to him the memory of the agony and distress of heart of his father Enoch, when in the midst of the peace and tranquility of Eden, there came a shriek of fear to penetrate the stillness, and all of Elder and Eden and the hosts of the heavenly ones were filled with the dread and dismay of alarm. Verse 126, and in that day Motzah the lamb was able to come to intervene in the face of their fear, and he caused the angels of heaven, who are called the Urkadashai, to pass over Eden to suppress Semihazah, and he met them in the place where they fled, and he slept with them. And on the morrow he brought the first protection elements known to man, and it was the Keli and the Keli bread. Verse 127, and the purpose of passage is to protect the righteous from fright and fear and from harm and the destructive forces of evil. It's got a side note here. It's got this evolves through time into the Jewish Passover. See Handbook of Established Righteousness for more information. So page 445. And from lies and from false visions and from the effects of the works of darkness and from the consequences of the temporal world when they are contrary to the will of Enoch. And this can be because the first day of tranquility was established in the purity of the natural world of Eden. Verse 128, and thus Motzah the lamb intervened again, being enabled by the acts of righteousness which occurred on the day of measure of Milo. For Enoch applies all of his holy days to all of his children. Verse 129, and this day is very dear to the heart of Enoch, for the protection of his lovely ones is magnified on that day, and his heart can rest from their being troubled with fear, and all of the holy hosts of heaven count the days with him from one holy day to the next. And again Motzah the lamb spoke to Enoch, and he told him another account of the troubled heart of Enoch, when all the people everywhere were in the pains of hunger, and the wicked in all the northlands were in much want, as were the righteous also who dwelt there. And all the lands of Anak, and the high places to the east, and the hand of Rabshalash, and also the encampment of Nod, had the righteous in them in the distress of want. Verse 131, and Enoch saw it, and he knew of the day of which the Lord spoke. And Enoch saw the sorrow of Enoch, and he was moved. And Motzah told him, I saw my father sorrowing as he travailed in the way, and I beheld him bent over in his grief. Page 446. And I intervened to come before Enoch, and I taught him how to plough, and the presence of my father rested in the ploughed fields of the meadows and on the open plain. Verse 132. And it is a happy day in the regions of Elder and the holy hosts of heaven, and it is a day for the foundation of the storehouse, and the day of the celebration of Enoch, and all the righteous shall partake of the first fruits on the day in which they receive them, with prayer and the joy of thankfulness. Verse 133. And in addition to that, on this day, which is a jubilee of days from the day of tranquility, it is a day of rich thanksgiving and of joining the hearts of the righteous to the hearts of the Urkadoshai. And on that day all the righteous shall feast, and the remaining first fruit shall be eaten, with the feeling that there is plenty for all. Verse 134. And the children shall rejoice and sing, and rich fellowship shall be obtained by the people, rehearsing stories of the kindness of Enoch to provide for them in the storehouse, and repentance shall abound, and the element of righteousness shall be used to join the people with the Urkadoshai, and Bedell shall find instruction on the high places of the land concerning the desires of Enoch in his heart, to have the righteous view creation as being their home and belonging to all the handiwork of his loving kindness. Verse 135. And it came to pass that again Enoch heard instruction in how to divide the days of men, and there was a day. Page 447. There was a day when Enoch saw that the youth of Toa and Heleah pursued a knowledge of mischief, and their fathers were of the corruption of Seiko, and the heart of Enoch was pained, and his eyes were filled with tears to see their manner of raising of children among them. And he also worried when he saw the righteous having wayward children, and he was afraid, and the workmanship of his hands would be led astray from one generation to another. Verse 137. And Motzah intervened again to call Enoch to the encampment of Machpelah, and to the barren waste places of the high plain in the east of Mahujah. And he brought Enoch dreams of instruction, so he could divide the waters of Sinir. And this was so that every man would be born into the world to have a conscience, to know right from wrong and good from evil. Verse 138. And in this way the righteous could choose more easily to cling to virtue, and they could love their fellows and become members of the congregations of Moeen. And thus came the day to celebrate, that man is responsible to remember. And it was a jubilee of days from the day of celebration of Enoch. And on this day the rocks were called to remembrance, and all the righteous eat together and rehearse to one another the testimony of their pathway to virtue, and to living together in the congregations of Moeen. And their ability to speak plainly and truthfully shall be expanded on this day, and the gift of charity shall be embraced in the midst of all those who desire to be holy. This holy day is called the Day of Remembrance. Page 448, verse 139. And it came to pass that Motzah the Lamb continued to instruct Enoch in how to divide the days of men. And he said, there was a time when Enoch was weary, and he was troubled in his soul, for it seemed sometimes that his children would not find their way to dwell with him. And his desire to dwell with his children is that which is foremost on the mind of the great Holy One. Verse 140. And Motzah the Lamb beheld the desires of his father, and he set a course to intervene. to establish a sure pathway for man to walk in, so they could fulfill the desires of his Father to dwell with his lovely ones. And when Yaakov found the grief of despair in the face of the sins of his children, insomuch that he lost all hope of ever returning to Eden, to dwell with Enoch, Matzah beheld it, verse 141, and he stepped into the waters of the brook of Baca to intervene with the covenant that he had made with Gabriel. And he raised Yaakov up, and when he had fallen down in his grief, and he named him Gabriel, and he covenanted before Enoch and Yaakov in the presence of the rocks of witness that Yaakov and all the righteous children would someday return to Eden to fill the desire of both their hearts. Verse 142, and with this covenant, the pathway back to Eden was come to dwell in both their hearts, and the division of days measures that pathway, and the celebration of new oil is a jubilee of days. End of part 2.